Welcome everyone today to today's Learning Lab using food prices for nutrition. My name is Christina Sokorenko, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Anna Herfurth, Rachel Gilbert, Jess Wallingford, and Leah Koslow. We represent the Food Prices for Nutrition project, which develops and applies new ways of measuring food security in the sense of access to an overall healthy diet. The work we do helps to shed light on food availability, consumer prices, and nutrition composition, and how they all affect the cost and affordability of meeting dietary requirements. The cost of a healthy diet and the number of people who can't afford a healthy diet are reported annually alongside other traditional food security monitoring indicators by the UN State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World reports. In this session, we're going to share the methods for calculating these indicators and offer participants the chance to calculate these indicators from a sample data set. So we're very delighted to have this chance to explore them all together and also learn from you about ways that it can serve all the work that you're driving today. And to kick off, what we'll do now is pass over to Anna Herfurth, who will share more on the cost and affordability of a healthy diet methods, an overview of the Food Prices for Nutrition project and history.
Great to see everyone here. Thank you so much for joining, and thanks, Christina, for the kickoff, and Alex. And we have a bunch of the Food Prices for Nutrition team here, and we're really excited to share today about the cost and affordability of a healthy diet and tools that you can use to calculate it. And we've been doing this learning lab for now 7 years. This is the 7th time we've done the lab. Next week will be the 8th time since we're doing this lab in person in Malawi. And it's really gone through an evolution. We often think of learning labs in conferences or in this conference as kind of going one way. The learning lab facilitators impart knowledge and tools that participants can then use, but it really is a two-way street, because in this process of doing the learning labs, we've learned a lot from participants, tested out the tools that have been slowly evolving over the last 7 years, starting with just a very basic calculation of how, what does it mean to calculate the least cost items that would satisfy healthy diet requirements. But when we started this many years ago, it was still the concept was there in the lab, but it was still a lot of steps that you would have to take to be able to do it yourself. And now we have been able to develop a toolkit which we hope will make it very easy for you to be able to calculate these indicators yourself if you have food price data and are wishing to incorporate indicators of the cost and affordability of healthy diets in your work. And that, in hearing back from people and honing these tools over time, they're also available for governments to use. One of our primary audiences with the metrics and the toolkit is that governments would be able to incorporate these indicators into routine monitoring using data that they already have on food prices. And so this kind of, informal, in a way, community of agriculture, nutrition, and health academy has really helped to shape the tools that people in government agencies can pick up, and we hope in the future, be able to incorporate them more into routine work as well. So I'm presenting on behalf of the whole team, many of whom are here today. Will Masters could not be here for this learning lab, but is the principal investigator of the Food Prices for Nutrition project. And so we work closely together. And overall, the purpose of this project is to be able to scale up monitoring and analysis of food prices, food price data that is collected in many places and readily exists, to use that data to guide agricultural production and food markets for improved nutrition. So we do this in 3 different main ways in the project. We are, first in the center, you see helping to build a global system to monitor change in food prices for nutrition. As Christina mentioned, we are working closely with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization to be able to monitor the cost and affordability of healthy diet every year as a global food security indicator. And in tandem with that, to support the use of these metrics in countries. And in this particular project, we have a set of high priority countries, which are in our grant. Malawi happens to be one of them. And prioritizing, it's a matter of just prioritizing time and resources available. However, in the vision of using these indicators is that they could be used and mainstreamed in any country. We would love to see that happen over time and into the future. And then there's a research component, which I think maybe many of you here will be able to contribute to over time as well, which is, we summarized it as analyzing the change in costs and affordability of healthy diets, but there are many different questions that could be answered using food price data, using these metrics of looking at access to healthy diets in markets and what that's related to, as a food environment indicator, what sorts of outcomes and on the one side and also agricultural factors on the other side are related to people being able to access healthy diets in the market. So this is a project that's a collaboration between Tufts, the World Bank, and IFPRI, but also there's many people involved here. We have our funding comes from the Gates Foundation and FCDO. We collaborate with FAO and lots of different people involved, too many to go through out loud, but you can see them on the screen. And we also are doing a lot of work with collaborators in country. So the overall vision of the work here, and if anyone has attended these learning labs in the past, you will have heard this before. But I think it's worth repeating that really it's a simple but big intention that we want food price measurement to match the aspiration in the global definition of food security, that when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And this project started actually the first phase of it back in 2016. And it was to be able to measure this definition more fully than it had been. Up until that point, there had been many years of measuring the prevalence of undernourishment, which is an indicator essentially of access to adequate calories. And then the food insecurity experience scale indicators had just been added in 2015 for people to report their own experience of worry or lack of access to adequate food. But it still hadn't captured this full definition because it was missing an indicator around nutritious food to meet dietary needs. And, we wanted to be able to shift the mentality and conversation around food security to really reflect this full vision and not only calorie needs. So we have worked closely with FAO. I led a couple of background papers in 2020 and 2022 to develop the method on the cost of a healthy diet. And this was then adopted by FAO last year and has been reported in the last 3 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World reports and will be perennially reported here. It's also now incorporated into FAO Stat. There's a link there. This is what it looks like on FAO stat. It's also the data that we have calculated globally is also available on the World Bank website at our Food Prices for Nutrition Data Hub. And so you'll find the global statistics on cost and affordability of a healthy diet that are aligned between the two resources on FAO stat and the World Bank Data Bank. So I guess let me back up and say, we're talking about the cost of a healthy diet, but to find that cost, first we have to be clear and identify what is a healthy diet. And fortunately, we did not have to come up with a brand new definition because many people around the world have already come up with many definitions of a healthy diet, which are basically codified in national food-based dietary guidelines, which are a set of recommendations that are developed and approved within countries. These dietary guidelines capture a realistic way for regular people to select nutrient adequate diets. So, we also talk about different indicators of cost of nutrient adequacy. There's been lots of work done on that, and those can be useful for certain applications. But when we're talking about, how do people go to the market and choose foods? Nobody has a computer in their head to do a linear program on all of the nutrient needs. And so, recognizing this, countries have developed a simpler way for people to choose nutrient adequate diets. And that is by food groups and proportions between food groups, and guiding people to select a variety of food items within different food groups. And that these diets would also be protective of health against non-communicable diseases, as well as palatable and dignified and culturally appropriate. And so we use these definitions and rest on these guidelines a lot because, first of all, they're a functional way for people to choose healthy diets, but they're also official policy standards on what constitutes dietary needs in the countries where they've been developed. So we use these dietary guidelines as a standard to answer the question, if you went to an average market in any country, how much would it cost to obtain a diet that satisfies dietary guidelines? And then how many people in a country could not afford that cost? This is very important in terms of food access because often dietary guidelines are used for nutrition education. And it's very helpful to know whether the nutrition education that's being put out and used is really feasible for people to follow, or whether there need to be more structural changes that would enable people to act on the education that's received on how to follow dietary guidelines. Here's one example of a country's national food-based dietary guidelines. This is from Benin. And we wanted to point out here that there are a few elements that we use in quantifying dietary guidelines to find the cost of meeting them. So one is the food groups which are identified. And here we have 5 different food groups which are recommended for daily consumption. Then we also have the information on the number of servings per day, which are recommended, and that consuming this number of servings of each of the food groups would result in a calorie adequate diet and a generally nutrient adequate diet as well. And then we have what is a serving, a definition of, if you say here 4 to 5 servings, then how many, what does that actually mean in terms of volume, and calories is defined as well. And so we use that information to quantify the dietary guidelines, and have done this for many different countries which have quantifiable guidelines, and looked for patterns across the different guidelines. So what you see in the center is kind of, if you imagine putting all of the guidelines one on top of the other, what emerges as the general recommendation, the average, proportions of food groups that are recommended across countries. And this average recommendations across countries is what we call the healthy diet basket. It reflects the commonalities across guidelines in terms of food group proportions. And what it looks like here is, it should be quite familiar to you, because this kind of proportionality, if you've paid attention to dietary guidelines at all, and maybe you haven't, but I'd be interested if after this you see them around more often, if your country has them, that this does emerge as something that's very frequently seen, where about half the plate is recommended in fruits and vegetables, about a quarter by volume in starchy staples, and about a quarter by volume in protein-rich foods, which include both plant source and animal source protein-rich foods, and a small proportion by volume in oils and fats. And you can see some examples on the side of a few different guidelines that have exactly this proportionality pictured on plates. And we actually, although this is shown by volume, we use calories as a consistent standard for maintaining proportionality, because the calories per gram can vary between different foods. So we keep calories at a constant and divide them between the different most commonly recommended food groups like this. So the healthy diet basket, again, being a global standard of criteria that represents commonalities of the most across most national food-based dietary guidelines, created for the purpose of calculating and comparing cost and affordability of healthy diets across countries. And here we have the 6 different food groups, which we see time and again in different guidelines. To operationalize this, we choose a number of items in each food group to find the cost of that group of items. So we choose one item in oils and fats for 300 calories, another 300 calories of legumes, nuts, and seeds in one item, 2 items for starchy staples, 1,160 calories, and 2 fruits, 3 vegetables to satisfy diversity that's often recommended across fruits and vegetables, in particular with the standard calorie amounts listed there, and then 2 animal source foods. And this adds up to 11 items, which generally satisfies, the recommendation of diversity across the food groups. That is often a recommendation as well. And we use least cost, the least cost items to compute the least cost healthy diet. So for each of those food groups, the number of items chosen, those are the cheapest items that we can see in any given food price data set. So if we had a data set from a particular market, we could say, looking across all of the prices in that data set, which are the cheapest items in the food group, so that, again, if you went to a given market, what is the lowest possible cost that you would have to spend to purchase a diet that meets dietary guidelines? So the important thing to know here is that the food group proportions stay constant, as illustrated in the last couple of slides, and they're constant by share of calories. But the food items are substitutable. So the healthy diet basket is not a set of particular items. It's a set of food groups. And the items which can be consumed are variable depending on what happens to be in the market at that particular season or day, or in this case, what are the cheapest items that are there when the data are collected. And when we have looked at this with a global data set that the World Bank International Comparison Program maintains, what we find is that on average in the world, when we select the cheapest items across all countries, on average, it comes out to $3.54 in international dollars as the average least cost diet that would meet the proportions in the healthy diet basket. And this sets a lower bound on economic access. if we were to imagine people selecting other foods based on taste or preferences, convenience, this would add to the cost. And so this is really the kind of price floor in terms of the minimum cost of a healthy diet, beyond which many other considerations could be added that would increase the cost. And so this is an amount which is quite far above the poverty line, the international extreme poverty line of $2.15. Clearly, the entire poverty line is lower than the amount that would be needed to purchase a healthy diet that would meet dietary guidelines, let alone the amount that could be credibly reserved for food, as people don't spend 100% of their income on food. In low-income countries, they tend to spend more like half of income on food. So this is a very consistent finding. It really doesn't matter which guideline is used. Any of the different letters on the bottom there represent different countries' national guidelines and the cost of each of those national guidelines, whereas the healthy diet basket is on the far left in blue. And by any definition of a healthy diet, the least cost way of meeting recommendations is above the poverty line, which has led to some work exploring how poverty lines are actually created, and the norm of using calories and typically consumed foods to set the food poverty line, if that may need to be re-examined or complemented so that a poverty line includes access to at least a least cost healthy diet. Another interesting finding is that when we look at the environmental footprints of least cost diets, we can see that there is some variation across different dietary guidelines. It tends to revolve around the amount of animal source foods that are recommended and whether plant source foods can substitute for those based on the specifications of the particular guideline. But when we look at the healthy diet basket, we see that it has about the same environmental footprint as the Eat Lancet diet, where Eat Lancet was specifically created to be an environmentally sustainable diet. So sometimes what we're looking at here is carbon footprint of the different diets. We've also looked at water footprint. And we've often heard people ask, well, healthy diet basket is a method for finding the cost of a healthy diet, but what about the cost of a healthy and sustainable diet? And so what we can say here is, in general, no extra calculation is really needed for a healthy and sustainable diet, because on average, we see that the least cost diets meeting the healthy diet basket specifications are actually quite sustainable and on par with the Eat Lancet diet. Then if we turn to affordability and answer the question of how many people in the world or in different countries cannot afford healthy diets, we use average expenditures, share of expenditures on food. As I mentioned, in low-income countries, people tend to spend about half of their income on food, 52% based on national accounts data. And so we compare the cost of each diet to 52% of income. And we use data from the World Bank to do that. And, it's interesting to note that there is a higher, the $2.15 is an extreme poverty line. There's also a higher international poverty line, and the cost of a healthy diet that we found globally is actually about 52% of that higher line, which is interesting to see, although that wasn't part of the methodology. And then when we use that income standard and expenditures to calculate affordability, we find this headline number that around 3 billion people in the world could not afford a healthy diet in 2020. And we see the majority of people unable to afford healthy diets are in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, with some substantial pockets in other regions. And, this has been calculated with, I'll go back here, with a global data set, again, maintained by the International Comparison Program. And this is useful to be able to use the same data set and the same standard across countries to be able to come up with a global figure and be able to track that. But we can actually also calculate the cost of a healthy diet in two different ways. So one is for global monitoring, using the healthy diet basket as a common standard to facilitate global comparisons. But for national monitoring, it is most policy coherent to actually find the cost of meeting the national food-based dietary guidelines. And so we have in the focus countries that we've worked on in the context of this project, looked at a number of countries' own food-based dietary guidelines and calculated the cost of a healthy diet using those. And this is, again, the global standard that we have used is this World Bank ICP data set, which is a global data set of food prices. But then, similarly to how we have national standards of a healthy diet, we also have national food price data that can be used, that countries are collecting consumer price index data on a very frequent basis, usually monthly or even more frequently, sometimes weekly. And that consumer price index data or other market information system data that's collected within countries at district or regional level is a lot of data that is frequently updated and is, again, the most up-to-date and granular and policy coherent way of looking at the food prices along with the dietary standard to calculate the indicators. This is just a note that if we're looking at the indicators calculated in these two different ways, there might be differences, and that's fully expected, using different data sets and slightly different standards, as well as the affordability calculation. These are three factors that could create differences between the figure that's published in the SOFI report for a country that's like one national average using data from 2017 versus a figure for the country that's using updated food price data and the country's own national dietary guideline. You can imagine that this will create some difference. Also, the percent of income spent on food at global level, we just use a single standard to create something comparable, but in country you can use the actual percent of income spent on food, which might be somewhat different than 52%. So just wanted to flag that, you might see studies or do studies of, national level costs and affordability of healthy diet, and it won't necessarily match what's published in the UN flagship reports. So before moving on, I just want to give a brief overview of some of the work we have done in countries. You can see in the map the focus countries for food prices for nutrition that are highlighted, where we've been supporting the regular calculation of these indicators using the data that's already collected by national institutions. The first place where we began was Tanzania and Ghana. We had initial meetings there back in 2016, and Ghana, actually, the Ministry of Food and Agriculture jumped in and piloted a longer food list in their market information system, realizing that their food list didn't include adequate diversity to be able to calculate the indicator. And this change in the food list has been institutionalized since 2017, showing a real commitment to tracking this indicator over time. And so, we've had a series of meetings with stakeholders in Ghana and also in Tanzania over the last few years. In Ghana right now, there's a lot of interest in really moving this into mainstream. Rachel and Christina were there a couple months ago to do an in-person training on the calculations with the government focal points. And this is Ghana's new food-based dietary guidelines that was just released this year. And so this is an additional impetus for the government stakeholders to immediately use these dietary guidelines to find the cost of meeting them across the country, and if that cost is feasible for people to achieve in different regions and different seasons. Ethiopia also recently released their first ever food-based dietary guidelines last year. The Ethiopian Public Health Institute is very involved in, from the start, trying to use these guidelines at systemic level, and not just as a tool for individual education, but as a tool to analyze food systems and help to highlight what needs to change in food environments for people to be able to achieve them. And so we've been working closely with the EPHI as well as the Ethiopia Statistical Service to help mainstream the indicators in their food price reporting systems as well. They're aiming to publish a monthly bulletin that will contain these indicators. Malawi, we are working with the National Statistical Office currently to analyze food price data to calculate the cost of a healthy diet, and that will be part of the workshop in person next week. And Kate Schneider, who was a PhD student in the project, did a bunch of work in Malawi previously that's been published. In Pakistan, we've been working primarily with FAO Pakistan. They're publishing a national state of food and nutrition security report called the POFI, aligned with the global SOFI. And so they've been looking at this indicator, as a national representation, more detailed, again, than the global one figure. And working closely with the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics that provides the data. So we've been supporting with a couple of workshops there as well. Nigeria, we just had a virtual workshop last week, and the National Bureau of Statistics is very much on board in terms of integrating this indicator and starting to find the most convenient ways to do that. There's a national food systems dashboard, which is in the works for Nigeria, and the cost of a healthy diet is one of the indicators that people are very keen to scale up, as it was, I believe, the only food environment indicator for which data is readily available. So as a indicator of the food environment, it is going to be very informative and help to link between agricultural production data and food security and nutrition outcomes within this whole food systems dashboard, looking across the food system. So that is a quick introduction to the many different efforts at country level. And again, through these learning labs and through these interactions with countries, we've developed a bunch of software tools and templates for calculation, which we will be introducing now today.
What I'm going to show you is just where these software tools live on our website. So let me share my screen quickly. So on our website, we have a whole page on the tools, and this is our website, the Food Prices for Nutrition website. I'm sure someone's about to share it in the chat, but we have the tools page. And so on the tools page, we have a description of a little bit of what Anna showed you, but what you can do is download the tools. So it's quite easy. You would just type in your name. And the reason we collect your information is just so that we can update you when we make any changes to the toolkit. These are always a work in progress. We're always trying to make them better and easier to use. So we collect your information, but you just type in your name and your email address, and you can download the full toolkit. So you'll get a link to your email. The tools have basically a lot of what you just saw today, but with a full set of instructions, we also have Stata code, and we have a little bit longer pseudo data there to practice with, to just demonstrate a couple of the functionalities of the toolkit. So feel free to go and download those and try them out yourself, look at the instructions, and you can always email us and ask questions as you're trying to implement this for your own data.
I know we just have a couple minutes left before the session closes automatically. And I wanted to just, move on to the closing remarks, and also, of course, thank you all for joining us today and being part of this. We're all so glad to be a part of this community with you and to continue learning from you about ways that Cost of a Healthy Diet can be used to serve your work. And I'll pass it to Anna, maybe just for last words before we break off.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina and Rachel. Really, Christina and Rachel have done the huge amount of heavy lifting here to create this very easy to use tool. So huge thanks to you both for making these tools easy to use and consistently incorporating the feedback that we get from people like you in the Learning Lab who are telling us what does and doesn't work well. So thanks for that too. And also to Leah and Jess for co-facilitating, and Julia and Alex also for setting this up. Really appreciated team effort. And just thanks to everyone here for all of your great participation, great questions. This was a lot of fun for us, and I hope it was for you too, and that you can use this in your work. Really appreciate the feedback. And we will definitely take this to Malawi with us next week and maybe see some of you there. But have a good rest of your day, and thanks for spending this time together.